My name is Mike Davidson. For the past 12 years, I've worked as a mechanic at Wilson's Auto Repair, a small family-owned garage tucked away on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. It's nothing glamorous, just an honest living fixing cars, changing oil, and replacing worn-out parts. My hands are permanently stained with grease, my fingernails never quite clean despite scrubbing them raw every evening. But I take pride in my work. There's something satisfying about taking a broken-down vehicle and bringing it back to life. Something that gives me purpose. That I grew up in this same neighborhood, the son of a factory worker and a school cafeteria cook. My parents taught me the value of hard work and honesty from an early age. I wasn't the best student, but I had a natural talent for understanding how things worked. After high school, I took some vocational courses at the community college and found my calling under the hood of a car. Old Mr. Wilson gave me my first job when I was just 19, and I've been there ever since, working my way up from the new kid sweeping floors to one of his most trusted mechanics that I met Sarah 8 years ago at Rosie's Diner, a local greasy spoon where she waited tables. I still remember that day perfectly. My truck had broken down that morning, so I had to walk the 3 miles to work in the pouring rain. By lunchtime, I was starving and soaked to the bone. I ducked into Rosie's more to escape the downpour than anything else. Sarah approached my table with a coffee pot in one hand and a warm smile that seemed to brighten the dreary day. She had chestnut hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, kind hazel eyes, and a light dusting of freckles across her nose. Nothing flashy, not the kind of beauty that stops traffic, but a natural, wholesome prettiness that made you feel comfortable right away. "You look like you've had a rough morning," she said, pouring me coffee without waiting for me to ask. "The special today is meatloaf, and between you and me, it's the best thing on the menu." "Sold?" I said, and she laughed, a genuine melodic sound that made me smile despite my soggy clothes and squelching boots. That I came back the next day, and the day after that. Soon I was having lunch at Rosie's nearly every day, always sitting in Sarah's section. We started talking, real conversations, not just about food orders. She was 26 then, 2 years younger than me, originally from a small town about an hour outside Columbus. She'd moved to the city 5 years earlier, chasing bigger dreams than her hometown could offer, but had found herself stuck waiting tables while trying to figure out what she really wanted from life. We went on our first date 3 weeks after we met. Nothing fancy, just burgers and a movie. But there was something so easy about being with her, a comfortable familiarity like we'd known each other for years. She laughed at my corny jokes and didn't mind my calloused hands. I listened to her stories about difficult customers and her dreams of maybe going back to school someday. Over the next 2 years, our relationship deepened. We had our arguments, sure. She thought I worked too much. I thought she was sometimes too impulsive with money, but we always found our way back to each other. We moved in together after a year, renting a small one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. It was cramped and noisy, but it was ours. When I proposed, I couldn't afford anything fancy. I saved up for 3 months to buy a modest diamond ring, half a carat, but it sparkled like it was worth $1 million when I got down on one knee in Goodale Park, the place where we'd had our third date. Sarah cried and said yes before I even finished asking the question. That we got married at the Franklin County Community Center 2 years after we met. No elaborate ceremony, no designer dress or fancy tuxedo, just us, our closest friends, and family. Sarah wore a simple white dress she found on sale, and I wore the same suit I'd worn to my uncle's funeral the year before. My buddy Tony from the garage was my best man, and Sarah's childhood friend Melissa was her maid of honor. We couldn't afford a honeymoon, so we spent a long weekend at a bed and breakfast in Hocking Hills instead. After the wedding, we managed to rent a small 2-bedroom house in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of Columbus. The house was nothing special, built in the 1970s with faded vinyl siding, a patchy lawn, and kitchen appliances that were probably older than both of us. But the rent was affordable, the neighbors were friendly, and there was enough space for us to start thinking about maybe having a kid someday. Sarah continued waiting tables at Rosie's, eventually becoming shift manager, while I kept working at Wilson's garage. Mr. Wilson had made me his head mechanic by then, which came with a modest raise but a lot more responsibility. Between our two incomes, we managed to keep our heads above water, but there wasn't much left over at the end of each month. We lived paycheck to paycheck, carefully budgeting for groceries, utilities, and the occasional small luxury like ordering pizza on Friday nights or going to the movies. Someday, I used to tell Sarah as we'd sit on our secondhand couch, watching our small TV, we'll save up enough for a down payment on our own place. Something with a real backyard where we can plant a garden. Sarah would smile and rest her head on my shoulder. I'd like that, she'd say. And maybe a spare room we could turn into a nursery when the time is right. To make that dream a reality, I started taking on extra shifts at the garage and even did some side jobs on weekends, fixing neighbors' cars in our driveway for cash that went straight into our savings account. It wasn't much, but it was growing. Slowly, Sarah picked up extra shifts too, and we were both often tired. But it felt like we were working towards something together. We weren't rich by any means, but we had each other, a roof over our heads, and dreams for the future. We had a small circle of friends, mostly other couples from the neighborhood, a few of my buddies from the garage and their wives, and some of Sarah's co-workers from the diner. We'd host backyard barbecues in the summer, gathering around our rusty charcoal grill while the guys talked cars and sports, and the women swapped recipes and neighborhood gossip. In the fall, we'd all crowd into someone's living room to watch Ohio State football games, everyone bringing a dish to share. During the holidays, we'd exchange modest gifts and share meals. Tony and his wife Beth lived just a few blocks away from us and became our closest friends. We'd often have them over for dinner, the four of us playing cards at our kitchen table until late into the night, laughing and talking about everything and nothing. Beth and Sarah became especially close, often going shopping together or meeting for coffee on their days off. Our life wasn't extraordinary. We weren't taking exotic vacations or driving luxury cars or living in a fancy house. We were just regular folks living regular lives, finding happiness in simple things and each other's company. Or at least, that's what I thought we were doing. Looking back now, I wonder if it was ever enough for Sarah. If I was ever enough. The first changes were so subtle, I almost didn't notice them. It was like watching a photograph slowly fade in the sun. You don't see it happening day by day, but suddenly you realize the colors aren't as vibrant as they once were. It started about 6 months ago, in October. The leaves were changing, and so, apparently, was my marriage. Sarah began picking up extra shifts at the diner. At least that's what she told me. On the surface, it made sense. The holiday season was approaching, and we could always use the extra money. But something about it felt off. Another late shift? I asked one Thursday evening as she was getting ready to leave, applying more makeup than she usually wore to wait tables. Yeah, Donna called in sick again, Sarah said, not quite meeting my eyes in the mirror as she applied a second coat of mascara. You know how short-staffed we are right now. I did know. Rosie's was always struggling to keep enough wait staff, especially during evening shifts. But this was the third emergency shift that week. I thought Thursdays were usually slow, I said casually. Leaning against the bathroom doorframe, Sarah's hand paused momentarily before continuing to apply her lipstick, a shade redder than she typically wore to work. Normally, yes, but there's some event at the convention center. Rosie expects a late rush. I nodded, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Want me to wait up? Don't bother, she said, dropping the lipstick into her purse. I'll probably be past midnight. You know how people linger after these convention things. I did wait up though, pretending to be asleep when she finally came home at 1:30 a.m. She moved quietly through our darkened bedroom, but I could smell it immediately. Cologne that wasn't mine, something expensive and unfamiliar that clung to her clothes and hair. When she slipped into the bathroom to shower before bed, something she rarely did in the middle of the night, the knot in my stomach tightened. The next morning over coffee, I casually asked, "How was the rush last night?" Sarah yawned dramatically. "Exhausting. These convention crowds are the worst. They don't tip well either." She stared into her coffee cup. "I'm not sure these extra shifts are worth it." Yet she kept taking them, 2 or 3 nights a week. And I noticed other changes too. Her phone, which used to lie carelessly on kitchen counters or coffee tables, became a closely guarded possession. It was always in her hand, her pocket, or face down beside her. It would buzz constantly, and she'd snatch it up with an alertness that made my heart sink. More than once, I'd walk into a room to find her in the middle of a conversation that abruptly ended. "Who was that?" I'd ask. "Just Melissa," she'd say. Or, "Beth had a question about that recipe I gave her." Or work stuff, nothing interesting. But the calls and texts came at all hours, early mornings, late nights, in the middle of family gatherings. And Sarah would take them in another room, speaking in hushed tones I couldn't quite make out. Point one night, her phone buzzed on the coffee table while she was in the kitchen. I glimpsed the screen before she could reach it. The message preview simply read, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Same time." The contact name was D. Work. When I asked who D. Work was, Sarah snatched up the phone and said it was a news server at Rosie's, Donna from work, who needed training on the register. The explanation came too quickly, too smoothly, as if rehearsed. Our Friday night tradition of ordering pizza and watching a movie together, something we'd done almost every week since we started dating, began to fall by the wayside. Beth asked if I could join her and the girls for drinks tonight, she'd say. Or, Melissa's going through a rough patch and needs someone to talk to. When I suggested calling Tony to see if he knew about Beth's plans, Sarah would quickly discourage me. "Oh, it's just us girls. Besides, didn't you say you wanted to catch up on that car manual for the new hybrid models?" I did say that once months ago. Now it had become her go-to excuse. Even when we were both home, something had changed. Sarah's warm smiles became less frequent, replaced by a distracted gaze that seemed to look through me rather than at me. Our conversations grew shorter, more superficial. When I tried to talk about our future plans, the house we were saving for, the family we might start, she would nod and agree, but without the enthusiasm she once showed. Physical intimacy, which had always been a natural, comfortable part of our relationship, became increasingly rare. Sarah was always too tired, too stressed, or had an early morning ahead. When we did make love, it felt mechanical, as if she was going through the motions while her mind was elsewhere. As winter settled over Columbus, bringing short, gray days and long, cold nights, I noticed another troubling pattern. Money was disappearing from our joint checking account. Small amounts at first, $40 here, $60 there, but then larger withdrawals. $200, $300. I brought it up one evening as we were paying bills at the kitchen table. "I noticed some withdrawals I don't recognize," I said, keeping my voice casual while showing her the bank statement. "Did you buy something special?" Sarah's face flushed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Oh, that. I've been putting aside some money for your birthday present. It was supposed to be a surprise. My birthday was 4 months away." "That's a lot for a present," I said. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You work so hard. You deserve something special this year." I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe that the withdrawal was for a thoughtful gift, that the late nights were really work, that the hushed phone calls were innocent. I'd always trusted Sarah. We'd built our relationship on honesty and openness. The idea that she could be lying to me, betraying me, was almost unthinkable. But the evidence was mounting, and that knot in my stomach was growing into something I couldn't ignore. The final straw came in early March. We'd been planning a weekend getaway for our anniversary in April. Nothing extravagant, just 2 nights at a bed and breakfast in Amish country. I'd been saving specifically for this, setting aside a little from each paycheck for months. "We might need to reschedule the anniversary trip," Sarah said one evening as we were washing dishes together, one of the few domestic activities we still shared regularly. "Rosie said she can't give me that weekend off. We've got a big party booking." I turned to look at her, soap suds dripping from my hands. "But we booked this 3 months ago. You requested the time off back in January." Sarah kept her eyes on the plate she was drying. "I know, but things change. Short-staffed again. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was at Rosie's. I also knew that Sarah, as shift manager, had control over the schedule. If she'd requested that weekend off months ago, there was no reason it would suddenly be denied. Something inside me broke. The trust that had been fracturing for months finally shattered completely. That weekend, when Sarah said she had to cover yet another Saturday shift, I decided to find out what was really going on. I'm not proud of what I did next. In all our years together, I'd never once thought about invading Sarah's privacy. I'd always believed that trust was the foundation of our relationship. But that foundation had crumbled, and I needed to know if I was being paranoid or if my worst fears were justified. On Friday night, while Sarah was in the shower, I installed a tracking app on her phone. It took less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes in which I felt like a different person, someone desperate and suspicious. But I couldn't go on like this. living with constant doubt and growing resentment. The next morning, Sarah got ready for her shift with the same routine I'd watched dozens of times in recent months. More makeup than necessary for waiting tables. Her hair styled carefully, a spritz of her expensive perfume, a Christmas gift from me that she'd rarely used before. "Don't wait up," she said, kissing me quickly on the cheek before heading out the door. Inventory after closing. "Might be really late." "Have a good day," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway before picking up my phone. The tracking app showed her location moving across town, in the opposite direction from Rosie's diner. I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Old Mr. Wilson didn't even question it. I'd built up enough goodwill that my word was never doubted. The irony wasn't lost on me that I followed the dot on my phone screen, driving my old Ford F-150 across Columbus until I found myself in Bexley, an area nicer than anywhere we could afford to live. The dot had stopped moving, settling on an apartment complex called the Parkview, a modern building with manicured lawns and a fountain out front. I parked across the street, feeling sick to my stomach. What was I doing? Following my wife like some kind of stalker? Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she was visiting a friend. Maybe she was planning a surprise for me. Maybe Sarah's car was parked in the visitor lot. I watched as she emerged from her beat-up Honda Civic, checking her reflection in the window before heading into the building. She moved with a lightness I hadn't seen in months, an eagerness in her step that made my heart constrict painfully. I sat in my truck for 3 hours. 3 hours of alternating between crushing certainty and desperate hope. 3 hours of imagining confronting her, of driving away and pretending I'd never followed her, of walking into that building and demanding to know what was going on at 2:17 p.m. I'll never forget the time. Sarah emerged from the building. She wasn't alone. A tall man with dark hair walked with her, his arm around her waist in a gesture of casual intimacy that spoke of long familiarity. At the door to the building, they paused. He leaned down, cupping her face in his hands, and kissed her, not a friendly peck, but the kind of passionate kiss that leaves no doubt about the nature of a relationship. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world seemed to tilt sideways. The man pulled back from the kiss, saying something that made Sarah laugh, that same melodic laugh I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago at Rosie's diner. She reached up to straighten his collar, a domestic gesture that suggested this wasn't new, wasn't a one-time thing. As they separated and Sarah walked toward her car, I got a clear look at the man's face. Dave Thompson, our insurance agent, the same man who'd sat at our kitchen table every year to review our policies. The same man who'd shaken my hand firmly and called me buddy while asking about the garage. The same man who'd once complimented Sarah and me on being such a solid couple compared to many of his other clients. I sank down in my seat as Sarah drove past, not wanting her to see me. Then I sat there for another 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd witnessed. It wasn't just the fact of her infidelity. It was the who and the how of it. Dave Thompson was everything I wasn't. College-educated, smooth-talking, driving a late-model BMW, and living in an upscale apartment complex. And Sarah had been lying to my face for months, constructing elaborate stories while spending time with him. Over the next week, I gathered more evidence. I didn't confront Sarah immediately. Some part of me needed to understand the full extent of the betrayal before facing it head-on. I checked our phone records online and found hundreds of text messages and calls between Sarah and a number I didn't recognize. When I searched the number, it came back registered to Dave Thompson Insurance. I went through our bank statements again, tracing the mysterious withdrawals. They coincided perfectly with Sarah's late shifts and girls' nights out. I found hotel receipts tucked into the pocket of a jacket she rarely wore. 3 different hotels around Columbus, all dated over the past 4 months. One evening, when Sarah was actually at work, I checked. I searched our bedroom and found a burner phone hidden in her underwear drawer. The messages on it left nothing to the imagination. Explicit texts, plans for their meetings, complaints about having to be careful and creative with their time together. Most devastating were the messages where they discussed their future. "How much longer do we have to keep this secret?" Sarah had written. "Just until I get the regional manager position," Dave had replied. "Then I can help you get on your feet after you leave him." You deserve better than living paycheck to paycheck with a grease monkey. And Sarah had responded, "You're right. I've wasted enough years. I want a real life, not just getting by." 8 years of marriage reduced to wasted years. My career, which had supported us, mocked as being a grease monkey. The life we'd built together dismissed as just getting by. I found evidence they'd been seeing each other for almost 4 months. And worse, they'd been using our savings, the money I worked overtime for, to fund their rendezvous. The special room rates, the dinners at restaurants I could never afford to take Sarah to, even weekend trips disguised as training seminars for Dave and girls' trips for Sarah, all paid for, at least in part, with money from our joint account. Money that was supposed to be for our future home, our future family. After a week of investigation, I had all the evidence I needed. More than I wanted. I confronted Sarah on a Tuesday evening. I'd chosen the time carefully, after dinner, before her favorite TV show, on her day off, so she couldn't escape to work. I placed the hotel receipts, bank statements, and printed text messages on the kitchen table and asked her to sit down. "What's all this?" she asked, but the color draining from her face told me she already knew. "The truth," I said simply, "about you and Dave Thompson." She didn't try to deny it, didn't try to explain or minimize or justify. She just sat there, staring at the evidence of her betrayal spread out on the same table where we'd eaten breakfast together that morning. "How long have you known?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Long enough," I said. "Why, Sarah? Was I not good enough? Did I not work hard enough? Did I not love you enough?" She looked up then, and I expected to see shame or regret in her eyes. Instead, I saw something closer to relief, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "Dave makes me feel special," she said, "like I'm more than just a waitress in a dead-end diner. He talks about ideas, about places he's traveled, about his plans for the future. He's going places, Mike. We've been stuck in the same rut for years." Those words cut deeper than any knife. "We were building something together," I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "We had plans, dreams, your dreams." She countered, "A small house in the same neighborhood we already live in. Maybe kids someday, but always waiting for the right time that never comes. Another 20 years fixing cars and serving coffee. That's not enough for me anymore. And Dave can give you more?" I asked. "He already has." She stood up, suddenly defiant. "He sees me, Mike. Really sees me. Not just as your wife or as a waitress, but as someone with potential. I've always seen your potential," I argued. "I've supported every idea you've ever had. College classes, starting that online business, everything. You're the one who never followed through." Her eyes flashed with anger. "Because I was too busy working to help pay our bills. Too tired from double shifts to think about anything else. And sleeping with Dave Thompson is going to fix that. It's not just about sex," she said, though the flush on her cheeks suggested that was certainly part of it. "It's about possibility. About finally having someone who can open doors for me instead of just struggling alongside me." We argued for hours, going around in circles. Every justification she offered felt like another betrayal. By the time we exhausted ourselves, one thing was clear: our marriage was over. Not just because of her affair, but because of the fundamental disrespect and dissatisfaction it revealed. "I want a divorce," I finally said. "Fine," Sarah replied, as if she'd been waiting for those words. "Dave says I should get half of everything anyway. Half the house fund, half the value of your tools, half of everything we own." Something cold settled in my chest then. Not just anger or hurt, but a steely resolve. If Sarah and Dave thought they could discard me and then profit from it, they had severely underestimated me. "We'll see about that," was all I said. I could have exploded after our confrontation. Could have driven straight to Dave Thompson's fancy apartment and beaten him to a pulp. Could have destroyed our house and everything in it in a rage. Could have aired our dirty laundry all over social media for everyone to see. That's probably what they expected, for the blue-collar mechanic to lose control, to react with brute force and blind anger, to give them the moral high ground in the aftermath. But something cold and calculating took over instead. If Sarah and Dave wanted to destroy what we had built, I would make sure they lost everything in the process. But I would do it smartly, methodically, legally. The morning after our confrontation, I went to work as usual. I didn't call in sick, didn't show any sign that my world had been shattered. When Tony asked why I looked tired, I mumbled something about a leaky pipe keeping me up. I focused on each car that came into the garage, channeling my pain and betrayal into precise, meticulous work at home. I maintained a similar facade. Sarah and I existed in a strange limbo, both knowing our marriage was over but still occupying the same space. She spent most evenings out, no longer bothering with excuses about work or friends. I spent mine planning. First, I met with a divorce attorney, not some high-powered lawyer in a downtown office with leather chairs and oak desks, but a straight-talking guy named Martin Reeves who worked out of a modest office above a barbershop. Martin had handled Tony's divorce 3 years earlier and had a reputation for being thorough and relentless without charging exorbitant fees. "Don't move out of the house," Martin advised during our first meeting. "No matter how uncomfortable it gets, moving out could be interpreted as abandonment and could affect property division." "What about our savings?" I asked. "We have about $13,000 in a joint account, most of it from my overtime and side jobs. She's already taken some for her activities." Martin made a note. "Document everything. Ohio's not a no-fault state. Infidelity matters, especially when marital assets were used to facilitate it. Start separating your finances, but do it properly. Open your own account at a different bank and redirect your paychecks there, but don't touch the existing joint money yet." The consultation fee was $200. I borrowed it from my brother, Mark, the only person I told about the situation at that point. Mark lived in Cincinnati with his family and had always been the more successful of the two of us. College degree, office job, house in the suburbs. We weren't especially close, but blood is blood. "You should clean her out," Mark advised. When I called him, "Take everything and leave her with nothing." "I want to do this right," I told him. "Legal, by the book, but I'm not going to let her walk away with half of everything after what she did." Mark wired me the money for the attorney, adding, "Pay me back when you can. And Mike, don't let them see you sweat." I took his advice to heart. I opened a new account at a credit union across town and had my next paycheck deposited there. I made copies of all our financial records, from bank statements to tax returns to retirement account information. I documented the joint assets we'd acquired during our marriage: furniture, appliances, tools, the single piece of decent jewelry I'd ever bought Sarah. But I was careful about my digital footprint, using the public library's computers to research divorce laws in Ohio and to set up a new email account that Sarah couldn't access. I cleared my browser history religiously and kept all documents related to the divorce in a locked toolbox in my truck. During this information gathering phase, I discovered something unexpected. Dave Thompson wasn't just cheating with my wife, he was cheating in his professional life as well. A chance conversation with a customer at the garage revealed that Dave had been engaging in questionable insurance practices, including forgetting to apply discounts clients were entitled to and, in some cases, billing them for coverage they never received. The customer, an elderly man named Henry, had brought his car in for an oil change and recognized my last name. "You're with Sarah Davidson? Your husband helped me straighten out that mess with my auto policy last year." I was confused. I'd never helped anyone with insurance issues. But I played along, asking vague questions that prompted Henry to share more details. "That Thompson fellow tried to tell me I needed all kinds of extra coverage because of my age. Charged me nearly double what I'd been paying. If your husband hadn't looked over the policy and pointed out I was being overcharged, I might never have known." It seemed Sarah had been impersonating a concerned wife seeking help for clients she knew were being overcharged. Perhaps her guilt had momentarily overwhelmed her, or perhaps it was just another way to feel superior to me. Pretending I was the one uncovering Dave's unethical practices, that I thanked Henry and filed this information away. A few discreet inquiries revealed that Henry wasn't the only one with complaints about Dave Thompson Insurance. A former employee of Dave's, a woman named Janet who now worked at a competing agency, was particularly forthcoming when I approached her under the pretense of switching my policies. "Between you and me," Janet said after I mentioned hearing some concerns about Dave's business practices, "that's why I left. Some of what goes on there isn't just aggressive sales, it's borderline fraud, especially with elderly clients or people who don't speak English well." I bought Janet coffee and listened as she detailed multiple instances of ethical violations. By the end of our conversation, she'd agreed to provide a written statement about what she'd witnessed while working for Dave, in exchange for my promise to report him to the state insurance commissioner rather than confronting him directly. He's charming but vindictive, Janet warned. If he thinks you're threatening his livelihood, he'll come after you. Best to let the authorities handle it. While gathering evidence about Dave's professional misconduct, I also discovered something else that fueled my determination. Sarah had been systematically undermining me to our friends for months, painting me as controlling, negligent, and unambitious. She'd been setting the stage for leaving me while keeping her reputation intact. I learned this from Beth, Tony's wife, who reached out to check on me after noticing I'd been quieter than usual at a neighborhood gathering. "I've been worried about you," Beth said when she stopped by the garage one afternoon. "Sarah's been saying things. I didn't know if I should get involved, but you've always been good to Tony and me." Over a coffee break in the garage's tiny office, Beth revealed that Sarah had been confiding in her and other friends for months, claiming I was emotionally distant, that I prioritized work over our marriage, that I was holding her back from pursuing her dreams. "The thing is," Beth said, looking uncomfortable, "none of it matched what Tony and I have seen over the years. You've always seemed so supportive of Sarah. I started wondering if she was setting something up." Beth's instincts were right, of course. Sarah had been crafting a narrative that would cast her as the victim when she eventually left, a woman who had tried everything to save her marriage to an unresponsive husband before reluctantly moving on. "Has she mentioned anyone else?" I asked carefully. "Someone she might be turning to for support?" Beth's hesitation told me everything. "She's mentioned her insurance agent a few times. Said he's been giving her financial advice, helping her understand options for her future." I thought it was odd. Since when does an insurance agent give career counseling? "Since he started sleeping with his clients' wives," I said flatly. Beth's eyes widened. "Mike, are you sure? That's a serious accusation." I showed her some of the evidence I'd gathered, careful to include only the facts of the affair, not the more personal text exchanges. Beth's shock turned to anger on my behalf. "That manipulative." She stopped herself. "What are you going to do?" "Get a divorce," I said simply. "But on my terms, not theirs." Beth promised to keep what I'd told her between us for now. "But Mike, when you're ready, Tony and I have your back. Whatever you need." That support meant more than Beth could know. In the weeks that followed our conversation, I continued gathering information and planning my next moves, all while maintaining a calm exterior. Sarah seemed to interpret my controlled demeanor as resignation or defeat, which suited me perfectly. I learned that Dave had been married before, a fact he'd never mentioned during our policy reviews. His ex-wife, Lisa, lived on the other side of Columbus. Obtaining her contact information took some detective work, but Martin helped me track her down through public divorce records. I approached meeting Lisa with caution, unsure if she would be willing to talk to me or if she might warn Dave. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods, a neutral location where neither of us was likely to encounter people we knew. Lisa Thompson was not what I expected. Based on Dave's polished appearance and obvious ambition, I'd imagined his ex would be similarly poised and professional. Instead, Lisa was a kindergarten teacher with a warm smile and tired eyes, dressed in jeans and a sweater with paint stains likely acquired in her classroom. "When you called, I almost didn't come," she admitted as she stirred her coffee. "But something in your voice." I recognized it. The same shell-shocked tone I had when I found out about Dave and his assistant. "So this is a pattern for him," I said, feeling a strange mix of validation and deepened betrayal. Lisa nodded. "Dave doesn't see boundaries the way normal people do. Other people's relationships, ethical guidelines, professional standards, they're all just obstacles to what he wants." She looked at me with genuine sympathy. "I'm guessing your wife isn't his first married woman." "Probably not," I agreed. "But she's my only wife." Lisa smiled sadly at that. "You know, the worst part wasn't even the cheating. It was how he managed to make me feel like I was the problem. Too demanding, too boring, too focused on building a stable life instead of chasing success the way he defined it." Her words echoed Sarah's accusations so closely that I felt a chill. "Did he leave you with anything?" I asked. "Debt and trust issues," Lisa said with a bitter. My conversation with Lisa Thompson proved more valuable than I could have imagined. Not only did she confirm Dave's pattern of predatory behavior, but she also provided insights into his professional vulnerabilities. Dave's entire identity is built on his reputation, Lisa explained. His business depends on people trusting him. It's what makes his betrayals so ironic. He's utterly untrustworthy himself. As we parted ways, Lisa handed me a manila envelope. These might help you. I kept them after the divorce, thinking someday they might matter. Inside were copies of emails between Dave and various women, including his former assistant, dating back several years. Also included were notes Lisa had made about clients who had complained about Dave's business practices. Why didn't you use these in your divorce? I asked. I just wanted out, she said with a shrug. Dave offered a quick settlement if I kept quiet, and I took it. Sometimes I regret that. I won't make the same mistake, I promised. Armed with Lisa's information and my own evidence, I began implementing the social destruction phase of my plan. I would dismantle the life Dave and Sarah thought they were building, not through violence or direct confrontation, but through careful exposure of the truth to the right people at the right time. First, I reached out to Janet, Dave's former employee. With her statement and the complaints I'd gathered from Dave's clients, I compiled a detailed report alleging insurance fraud and submitted it to the Ohio Department of Insurance. I included documentation of specific violations, overcharging elderly clients, misrepresenting coverage, and billing for services never rendered. The complaint was anonymous, but thorough enough to trigger an investigation. Next, I approached Dave's regional manager, the same position Dave was angling for. I presented myself as a concerned client who had discovered concerning practices. While reviewing my policies, I shared just enough evidence to raise serious questions about Dave's ethics without revealing my personal connection to the situation. I've always had a good experience with your company, I told the manager, Mark Stevens. But these discrepancies concern me, and I thought you should know before I take my business elsewhere. Stevens was appropriately alarmed. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Mr. Davidson. Rest assured, we take these matters very seriously. I also discovered that Dave was a member of the local Chamber of Commerce and served on the board of a business networking group that brought him many of his clients. Using an anonymous email account, I sent detailed information about Dave's ethical violations to key members of both organizations, framing it as a concerned whistleblower report. While I worked on undermining Dave professionally, I also carefully managed the narrative about our marriage's collapse. I knew Sarah had been telling a story that cast me as the villain, so I needed to counter that without seeming vindictive or bitter. That I started with Tony and Beth, who were already sympathetic. I shared the basic facts of Sarah's infidelity without the more sordid details. They were appropriately outraged on my behalf. I can't believe she's been lying to all of us, Beth said, tears in her eyes. Making us think you were the problem when she was the one sneaking around. People should know the truth, Tony insisted. This isn't right. I asked them to be discreet, knowing full well they wouldn't be. Within a week, the news had spread through our social circle. Friends who had been distant, influenced by Sarah's version of events, reached out to express their support. Invitations to social gatherings that had dried up suddenly reappeared. Sarah noticed the shift immediately. What have you been telling people? She demanded one evening, storming into the living room where I was reading. The truth, I replied calmly. Something you might want to try sometime. Her face flushed with anger. You're trying to make everyone hate me. I don't have to try, Sarah. Your actions speak for themselves. The social isolation began to affect her. Friends stopped returning her calls. She was removed from the neighborhood book club group chat. Even her co-workers at Rosie's Diner were giving her the cold shoulder after I had a quiet word with Rosie herself, who had always treated me like family when I came in for lunch. I've known you since you were a skinny kid fresh out of vocational school, Rosie told me, her weathered face creased with concern. You've always been decent and hardworking. Sarah's behavior doesn't sit right with me. While I never asked anyone to exclude Sarah, I didn't discourage it either. The community we'd built together was choosing sides, and they weren't choosing the woman who had betrayed her husband with the local insurance agent known for overcharging the neighborhood's elderly residents. Meanwhile, Dave's professional world was beginning to crumble. The Ohio Department of Insurance investigation was in full swing, with investigators reviewing his client files and interviewing former customers. Anonymous tips to the local business Press resulted in a small but damaging article questioning ethical practices at certain insurance agencies, with Dave's name prominently featured. His regional manager position evaporated before he could even interview for it. The Chamber of Commerce quietly asked him to step down from his committees. Clients began requesting transfers to other agents. The pressure was getting to both of them. Sarah came home one night in tears, saying Dave had been short with her and was blaming her for his professional troubles. "Why is this happening now?" she sobbed, not directing the question at me, but simply voicing her frustration to the empty kitchen. Everything was going so perfectly. I observed her distress without comment, feeling neither pleasure nor remorse. This was simply the natural consequence of their choices. The final blow to their social standing came when I arranged for Dave's wife, his current wife, not Lisa, to learn about his affair with Sarah. Through carefully orchestrated circumstances that couldn't be traced back to me, Kate Thompson discovered text messages between her husband and my wife. The confrontation that followed played out in surprisingly public fashion. Kate showed up at Rosie's during Sarah's shift, creating a scene that ensured everyone in the diner, staff and customers alike, heard exactly what Sarah had been doing and with whom. "You think he loves you?" Kate had reportedly shouted. He told the exact same lines to the last two women. "You're nothing special, just another gullible idiot who fell for his routine." Sarah was mortified. By the next day, everyone in our social circle had heard about the incident. Any sympathy she might have retained evaporated. She was no longer just a cheater. She was a fool who had been played by a serial philanderer. Dave wasn't faring any better. Kate had thrown him out of their house and filed for divorce, adding a second layer of legal troubles to his growing professional issues. The Ohio Department of Insurance investigation had expanded, with formal charges of ethical violations pending. His client base was shrinking daily. All of this happened without a single direct confrontation between Dave and me. To him, I was just the unfortunate husband in the background of his life's collapse. He likely never suspected that the systematic dismantling of his professional and personal life traced back to the grease monkey he'd so casually dismissed. Sarah, however, began to suspect my involvement. "This is your doing, isn't it?" she accused one evening, her voice hoarse from crying. "You're behind all of this." I looked up from the divorce papers I was reviewing. Behind what exactly? Dave's shady business practices? His history of affairs? Your decision to throw away 8 years of marriage? No, Sarah. Those things are on you and your boyfriend. She stared at me, a flicker of the old Sarah, the woman I'd loved, briefly visible beneath the anger and fear. "I never wanted it to be like this." "Neither did I replied honestly. But here we are. By the time we reached our court date for the divorce proceedings, both Sarah and Dave were social pariahs in the community we'd once called home. Their dream of building a new life together was crumbling under the weight of investigations, lawsuits, and public disgrace, and we hadn't even gotten to the legal battle yet. My attorney, Martin Reeves, looked inconspicuous sitting at the table in his off-the-rack suit and scuffed shoes. Next to Sarah's lawyer, a polished woman in designer clothes whose hourly rate probably exceeded what I made in a day, Martin appeared outmatched. But appearances can be deceiving. "Remember," Martin murmured as we waited for the judge, "let them think they have the upper hand. Overconfidence makes people careless." I nodded, watching Sarah and her attorney huddled in conversation across the room. Sarah kept darting nervous glances my way. She'd expected me to give up, to accept her terms just to get the divorce over with. She didn't understand the depth of my resolve. The weeks leading up to this moment had been a careful chess game. On Martin's advice, I had documented everything. Every bank withdrawal Sarah had made to fund her affair, every asset we owned, every contribution I'd made to our joint savings. I had witness statements from friends who could testify to Sarah's public admissions about the affair. I had evidence that she had used our joint funds to finance hotel rooms and gifts for Dave. But our strongest advantage came from an unexpected quarter. 2 weeks before our court date, Dave Thompson was formally charged with insurance fraud. The investigation I had triggered had uncovered systematic violations spanning years. His professional life was in ruins, and he faced possible criminal penalties. Sarah's attorney had tried to separate these issues from our divorce proceedings, arguing that Dave's legal troubles had no bearing on the division of our marital assets. Martin disagreed, and the judge seemed inclined to consider the connection, particularly as it related to Sarah's credibility and character. Your Honor, Martin began when our case was called. This is not simply a matter of dividing property between two people whose marriage didn't work out. This is about holding accountable a spouse who systematically betrayed trust, misused joint funds, and conspired with a now disgraced insurance agent to defraud my client. Sarah's attorney objected immediately, calling Martin's characterization inflammatory and prejudicial. The judge overruled her, allowing Martin to continue. For the next 2 hours, Martin methodically presented our case. He showed bank records demonstrating how Sarah had withdrawn money from our joint savings to finance her affair. He presented hotel receipts found in her possession, matching them to withdrawals from our account. He called Beth to testify about Sarah's admissions regarding the affair and her plans to leave me once Dave secured his promotion. Most damaging was the evidence that Sarah had been aware of Dave's fraudulent business practices. Janet testified that she had witnessed Sarah in Dave's office reviewing client files she had no legitimate reason to access, and discussing which clients might be vulnerable to overcharging. Your Honor, Martin concluded, Mrs. Davidson was not merely having an affair. She was actively participating in a conspiracy to defraud both her husband and Mr. Thompson's clients. She used marital assets to support this relationship and these activities. Under Ohio law, this constitutes financial misconduct and should heavily impact the division of assets. Sarah's attorney fought back, painting me as controlling and vindictive, suggesting I was trying to leave Sarah destitute out of spite. She argued that regardless of the affair, Sarah was entitled to half of our marital assets under Ohio's equitable distribution laws. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who had heard every possible divorce scenario during her career, seemed particularly troubled by the financial aspects of Sarah's behavior. Mrs. Davidson, she said at one point, fixing Sarah with a penetrating stare, am I to understand that you used funds your husband earned through overtime work, funds specifically saved for a future home purchase, to finance hotel rooms for your extramarital relationship? Sarah flushed. It wasn't like that, Your Honor. I was unhappy in my marriage. Dave offered me a way out, a better future. That wasn't my question, the judge replied coldly. Did you use joint marital funds for this purpose? Yes, Sarah admitted, her voice barely audible. But I contributed to those savings too. According to the financial records presented, your contributions amounted to less than 30% of the total savings, the judge noted. And you appear to have withdrawn nearly all of your contribution for personal expenses related to your affair. The final ruling came down heavily in my favor. The judge cited Sarah's financial misconduct and the misuse of marital assets as justification for an uneven distribution. I was awarded 75% of our joint savings account, full ownership of my tools and equipment, and the majority of our household belongings. Sarah was ordered to reimburse me for the funds she had withdrawn to finance the affair. Additionally, because Ohio considers infidelity when determining alimony, Sarah's request for spousal support was denied entirely. The court finds that Mrs. Davidson's actions constitute financial misconduct under Ohio law, the judge stated in her ruling. Furthermore, her participation in potentially fraudulent activities with Mr. Thompson reflects poorly on her credibility and character. The division of assets will reflect these findings. As we left the courtroom, Sarah approached me, her face tear-streaked but her eyes burning with rage. Are you happy now? She hissed. You've taken everything. I looked at her, this woman I had loved for 8 years, with whom I had shared dreams and built a life, and felt nothing but a hollow victory. No, Sarah, I'm not happy, but I am done. 1 year after the divorce was finalized, I stood in the driveway of my new home, a modest 3-bedroom ranch house with a large garage and a fenced backyard. It wasn't a mansion or a luxury apartment, but it was mine, purchased with the savings I'd protected in a small inheritance from my uncle. The aftermath of the divorce had been chaotic for Sarah and Dave. Dave's insurance fraud charges had resulted in a plea deal, a substantial fine, community service, and the permanent revocation of his insurance license. His divorce from Kate had been finalized around the same time as ours, leaving him with significant alimony payments and limited assets that I heard through the grapevine that Dave and Sarah had briefly attempted to make their relationship work despite their mutual downfall. Without his career or professional standing, Dave had soon tired of Sarah. The last I'd heard, he had moved to Florida to work at his brother's car dealership, a significant step down from his former life. Sarah had struggled. More directly, Rosie had kept her on at the diner out of pity, but demoted her from shift manager back to regular waitstaff. Her reputation in the community was in tatters. Old friends avoided her, and new ones were hard to come by once the story of her affair inevitably circulated. She had moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, starting over at 35 with little to show for the previous decade. Once, about 6 months after the divorce, I ran into her at the grocery store. She looked older, tired, the confident spark in her eyes dimmed to a dull resignation. We made awkward small talk near the produce section, her asking about the garage, me inquiring if she was doing okay. "I made a terrible mistake, Mike," she said suddenly, her voice cracking. "I threw away everything good in my life for a fantasy." There was a time when those words would have moved me, might even have opened a door to reconciliation. But that time had passed. Too much had been revealed, not just about her actions, but about her character, her view of me and our life together. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Sarah," I said sincerely. "I really do." As I walked away, I felt the last lingering threads that had bound us together finally snap clean. Whatever feelings of betrayal, rage, and hurt that had driven my calculated revenge had dissipated, leaving behind a strange peace. My own life had taken unexpected turns in the years since the divorce. Old Mr. Wilson had finally decided to retire and had offered to sell me the garage. With a small business loan and the settlement money from the divorce, I became the owner of what was now Davidson's Auto Repair. Business was good, my reputation for honest work and fair pricing had spread throughout the community. Tony and Beth had remained loyal friends through everything. Tony now worked for me at the garage, and Beth had introduced me to her cousin Rachel, a kindergarten teacher who had recently moved to Columbus. Rachel and I had been dating for 3 months, taking things slow, both of us cautious after previous relationship wounds. Unlike Sarah, Rachel seemed genuinely impressed by my work, asking questions about the cars I fixed, and even learning to change her own oil under my guidance. She didn't see me as a grease monkey, but as a skilled technician and business owner. And I saw her as she was, kind, dedicated to her students, content with simple pleasures, but always curious about the world. On this particular evening, as I unloaded groceries from my truck, Rachel pulled into the driveway. She was bringing homemade lasagna for dinner and a movie she thought I'd enjoy. Nothing fancy, nothing pretentious, just good food and good company. "Need a hand with those?" she called, getting out of her car with the casserole dish balanced carefully in her arms. "I've got it," I replied, gathering the last of the bags. "How was school today?" As she launched into a story about her students' art project gone hilariously wrong, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. This was what moving forward actually felt like. Not the hollow victory of watching someone who hurt you suffer, but the genuine joy of building something new. My revenge had been complete and devastating. I had methodically dismantled the lives Sarah and Dave thought they were creating together. I had protected what was rightfully mine and exposed their deceptions to everyone who mattered. I had won in every measurable way. But standing in my driveway with Rachel, laughing about kindergartners and spilled paint, I realized that the best revenge wasn't what I had done to Sarah and Dave. It was this, finding happiness again, building a life that was actually better than the one I had lost. Sarah had been wrong about me, about us, about what constituted a good life. My work-calloused hands and practical dreams weren't limitations, they were foundations. My loyalty wasn't naivety, it was strength of character. The simple pleasures and steady progress of our life together hadn't been just getting by. They had been the building blocks of something real and enduring, something she had been too blind to value. As Rachel and I settled in for dinner, I realized I no longer carried anger towards Sarah. What would be the point? She had lost everything of value, not because I had taken it from her, but because she had never truly understood what was valuable in the first place. That, in the end, was the price of her betrayal. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more real-life accounts of betrayal and its consequences. Remember, these stories are shared not to promote vengeance, but to illustrate the human capacity for resilience in the face of profound betrayal. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting better.